welcome back. I'll switch to English since we have a very distinguished guest here with us through Zoom here. I'll introduce him in a second, even though he probably doesn't need any introduction for you, but anyway, he will get it. Purpose with this session 3 here is now to show the research frontier in issues on productivity and labor market research in general. There is truly a new view rising, and many researchers, international researchers, Danny Roderick, Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, and of course Daron Acemoğlu are producing a lot of interesting new research, a new understanding of economy and the labor market, where the division of power is a key issue, a key instrument. Even organizations as OECD, IMF, and the European Union Commission have widened their analysis on these issues. Technological change and economic policy are not sort of deterministic processes, but rather a result of decisions, conscious or unconscious. So we are very, very happy to welcome one of the leading thinkers to our conference. Daron Acemoğlu is professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the US, and he's one of the, I would say, most known researchers in economics today. He's produced a tremendous amount of highly interesting research on connections, mainly connections between technological change, prosperity, and equality. And Power and Progress, our 1,000-year struggle over technology and prosperity, is the latest book by Daron Acemoğlu and Simon Johnson. And we will hear about that. We will listen to you in about 35-40 minutes. After that, I will have a discussion with you and possibility for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. And after an hour, we are done with Daron. We will let him go to other important tasks. And then we'll continue with the panel that I will introduce later on. And the discussion will follow in Sweden. That's our setup. Hope you're fine with that, because that's what I have to offer for you for the moment. So please, Daron, the floor or the scene is yours.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the invitation. It's my true honor to be able to address you. And as Laura said, I want to talk about inequality, productivity, and technology-related issues. And in particular, I'm going to base this on my recent book with Simon Johnson, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. The reason why Simon and I wrote the book is because we are convinced that, whether you like it or not, advances in technology, mostly digital technologies and AI, but others as well, are going to impact every or most aspects of our lives. But there is no guarantee that they will deliver shared prosperity, because the direction of these technologies is very much crucial for who will benefit. And that direction depends on who controls the technologies, what kinds of ideas, what kinds of visions, what kind of business models and market structures guide these technologies. And part of the reason why we wrote the book is because these issues, though central to us, and although central throughout history, are not at the forefront of the discussions. And in particular, at least in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, there is a deep techno-optimism that somehow, because these technological advances are impressive and there are some breakthroughs in terms of what we are capable of doing, that will necessarily be good for shared prosperity, for welfare, for other social objectives. And in particular, the idea that many people from the tech industry and journalists refer to is actually originating in economics. There is a deep-seated belief, backed by some theory and some evidence, that technological improvements lead to productivity increases, and then those productivity increases trickle down to workers and form the basis of shared prosperity. This is not the sort of Reaganite trickle-down idea. It's broader than that. And so therefore, Simon and I call it the productivity bandwagon. Now, the reason why this is a very, very important idea is because it's neither fully true nor fully false. Contrary to claims that you may hear, there are many instances in which the productivity bandwagon doesn't work, but then there are many, many instances in which it does work. So it's very important to understand why it works, why it doesn't work, and whether it's likely to work in the age of AI. So first of all, technological improvements can be used for many things that may not necessarily improve productivity. And I think one issue is, for example, if you use technological improvements for surveillance, monitoring, and so on, and I'll come back to that. But imagine that just like the sort of narrative about AI is sort of claiming that technology improves, productivity indeed rises, meaning that we produce more output, more goods and services with the same amount of factors of production. Why should that actually benefit workers? Why should that be the basis of shared prosperity, where wages increase, different types of skills are also rewarded more? And I think the basic story in economics models is like this. When productivity increases, firms want to hire more labor because labor has become more productive. And then when they do want to do that, they go out to the market and increase the demand for labor, and that bids up wages. Now, if you actually think of this, both from a theory point of view and from a historical point of view, there are two important steps in this argument. One is that, indeed, when productivity increases, firms want to hire more labor, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. And second, when firms want to hire more labor, that will actually bid up wages. And I would say both these two steps are at the center of understanding what AI are going to do. They're about the nature of technology. Do higher productivity increases indeed encourage more labor hiring? And whether greater labor demand leads to higher wages for workers. So those are the issues of nature of technology and political social power. So let me start with the latter. Here are two examples from recent or relatively recent history, going back to medieval and then the early stages of the industrial age, which are true breakthroughs, the AIs of their day. The windmills were one of many innovations during the medieval period. These were not dark ages in terms of new organizations, new crops, new technologies, but probably they were the most important one. They really transformed energy consumption for a number of tasks, increased productivity in many different aspects of the economy. But if you look at the data, you don't see any positive effect on the wages of workers. Why not? Because the medieval economy was organized around a type of coercion between servile laborers and a very unequal distribution of land and power in the hands of the church hierarchy and the aristocracy. And the new technology was also controlled by the same powerful groups. Abbots and lords came to run all of the windmills. They coerced laborers to provide work if they needed to, and they even could coerce people to bring, for example, their flour to the windmills for higher prices than they would be willing to pay. So the distribution of power critically matters. If power is in the hands of a few people, there is no guarantee that even breakthroughs like the windmill are going to benefit workers, benefit producing people, benefit everybody. The contraption on the right makes that same point even more forcefully. This is Eli Whitney's cotton gin. It's one of several gins that came up around the same time. And they revolutionized the economy of the US South, which was a backwater, not super good at anything, essentially before the cotton gin, and then became the largest exporter and largest producer of cotton, which fueled the British Industrial Revolution. Amazing fortunes were made for many, many people, both landowners and intermediaries. But The people who actually did the cotton production, the workers, saw no benefits. Their conditions worsened because they were the enslaved Black people. They were forcefully moved to the deeper South. They were coerced to work longer hours under unhealthier and very coercive circumstances. Again, power is key. But you might think, power is not as bad today. We live in an enlightened economy. We don't have lords and abbots. We don't have slave owners. So perhaps power-related issues are less important in the industrial age. Well, the Industrial Revolution both contradicts that statement and also starts illustrating the central role that the nature of technology plays. And in fact, the Industrial Revolution is very useful for us to study because one of the very often heard arguments in favor of techno-optimism is that in the past, things have worked out when there were revolutionary technologies, so you should not stop or slow down the process of AI because ultimately, just like during the industrial age, we're all going to be beneficiaries of industrial or technological breakthroughs. Well, there is again some truth to that, but only some. The first phase of the Industrial Revolution was not very good for the working people. Starting around 1750, new factories and more advanced machinery started spreading and changing the production process. But for the first 80 or even 90 years of the Industrial Revolution until about 1840s, there was very little benefit for the working people. The real incomes didn't increase much. Working hours increased by about 20%. So hourly real wages, inflation-adjusted wages probably fell. Working conditions got much worse. In factories, workers lost autonomy. They worked longer hours under unhealthier conditions. Again, that's about power. The factory system was a way of controlling workers, but it's also about the nature of technology. So the British Industrial Revolution tells us about why this step from productivity rises to workers also benefiting is also a more complex one. So in particular, the idea that as productivity increases, you're going to want to hire more labor is not generally supported by economic theory. So it's a little curious that it's become such a staple part of the interpretations of AI, digital technologies, and so on. Economic theory tells you that the willingness of employers to hire labor and to pay labor is related to marginal productivity, meaning what a worker contributes to the production process. Now, productivity increases could go hand in hand with lower contribution from workers. And that's what, in particular, the automation focus of the early British Industrial Revolution, that machines displacing labor, especially semi-skilled labor, was all about. So, and you see that, for example, with the groups of workers in the most dynamic sectors, for example, textile, weavers, lost about 2/3 of their real earnings from the early 19th century to around 1820s, 1830s, because they were displaced from their jobs. So what's going on here? And I think the best way of understanding that is through this humorous story that's often said about the modern factory or the future of the factory. The story is that the factory of the future will have 2 employees, a man and a dog. The dog is there, so the man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure that the man doesn't touch the machinery. So that is the ideal of the fully automated factory that's been around, since the beginning of the 20th century. But crucially, you can see that in this factory, productivity is very high. You have only 1 employee if you count just the man, or 2 if you count the dog as well. And the factory is producing a lot of output. But you can also see that the contribution of the worker is very low. If the factory becomes more productive, the boss will not rush out to hire more men and their dogs. So you see this big wedge between productivity, how much you can produce with a given amount of labor, and the contribution of that labor. The problem is automation, and just focusing on automation doesn't by itself increase the worth of labor and the contribution of labor. And that, I think, is a critical aspect of the discussions we need to have around digital technologies and AI. Now, just to complete the picture, part of the problem during the Industrial Revolution was indeed about power. And it wasn't just that power was unequally distributed, but that power was becoming more unequal. In particular, Handloom weavers, for example, skilled artisans had a lot of power because they had autonomy. They were experts in their work. The factory system was about greater monitoring surveillance, something that's again relevant in the age of AI. And many of the schemes, such as Jeremy Bentham's famous panopticons, were ways of using technology, using organization, in order to reallocate power away from workers towards bosses, managers, and so on. And of course, living conditions were hell. Cities were so unhealthy, so badly sanitized, that life expectancy in places such as Manchester or London fell to about 30 years at birth. So why then do we remember the British Industrial Revolution as a happy phase? Why is it that techno-optimists can say, well, look, things have worked out in the past? Because they did. After 1840, there was a turnaround. The factory system became less harsh. Real wages started increasing. Cities got clean. But I will argue there was nothing automatic about that. That was a choice about both power, organizations, and the direction of technology. And the reason why I'm emphasizing these things, because before I come to how that was done in Britain and how that was done in the rest of Europe and in the United States, I want to first point out that these things are not of just theoretical interest. Modern times are different, but not fully. Modern times are different, and let me illustrate that by showing you some data from the US. Modern times are different because we do have a recent history of shared prosperity. And I think this picture here, which depicts the evolution of real wages, again, inflation-adjusted wages for 10 demographic groups, men and women and workers of different education levels, going all the way from the bottom, orange for workers without a high school degree, green workers with a high school degree, associate degrees, just a college degree, and postgraduate degree. And you see that from 1963 to the mid-1970s, you have this period where all of these curves are tracking each other. That means that cumulatively real wages are growing, and they're growing in a very parallel fashion for these 10 demographic groups. Low-skilled workers, high-skilled workers, men and women are all more or less benefiting from this growth at the same rate. And if you go for the 1950s, the late 1940s, you see the same pattern from other data sources. You can't break it out in the same way, but you see, in fact, slightly faster real wage growth for low education workers. So we had a period in which inequality didn't increase while productivity was rising. And in fact, wages grew very rapidly during this period in the United States and in many parts of the industrialized world. Real wages grew about 2.5% a year in real terms, which is remarkable, which means in about 30 years, you double the real income you have as a worker. These trends are both specific to the United States and common across countries. Specific to the United States because the US, and this is an important point to note, and I'll be a part of an explanation, was already very unequal by the time we entered the digital age, say the mid-1980s. And it has had some of the largest increases in inequality. So there are some features of this pattern that are unique to the United States. No other country has had this pattern where it's not just inequality increasing from 1980s onwards, but the real wages of low education groups falling very sharply. That's a very US-specific pattern. The breakdown in shared prosperity is very extreme in the United States. But on the other hand, you also have that inequality increase in many other countries. Sweden, I'll come back to that, shows a large increase in inequality in the OECD. You see it in Germany, in New Zealand, in Italy, even in Finland. But on the other hand, while there are these common forces which sometimes lead to inequality, each country institutionally has responded to these features, to these developments differently, so that we can learn a lot from how different countries have dealt with the digital age, how they have fared in terms of productivity, how they have fared in terms of inequality, how they have fared in terms of wages, and so on. But the remarkable breakdown in shared prosperity is unique to the United States, but has traces of it that you can see in other countries. The Swedish case, I don't need to tell you much, but it's very interesting because the OECD data shows this increase in inequality. If you look at wage data, you actually see, in fact, a slightly less inequality in Sweden, both among men and among women. But what's going on is that while wages and earnings are becoming not so much more unequal in the United States, disposable income is becoming more unequal because work hours are changing and transfer patterns are changing, and capital income increases a lot. So this is why Sweden is much more unequal if you look at total income, including capital income, than when you look at just earnings on here. And that's also, you see a little bit of that in Denmark. So again, the way that you deal with these changes, what you do in workplaces, what you do in terms of taxation, are of first order importance about who gains, who loses. But I'm going to argue it's actually even more first order importance for productivity and the direction of technology. And to understand that, I think the best way of proceeding is to look at how is it that both Britain in the second half of the Industrial Revolution and the United States in the first half of the 20th century and much of the industrialized world in the decades that followed World War II actually achieved the productivity bandwagon, where productivity grew and there was something like shared prosperity, like this picture here illustrates, before it broke down. And I'll come back to the breakdown in a second. And I think it's got two pillars related to the two forces that I have emphasized. First, power. All of this was embedded in an environment in which the balance of power between capital and labor was becoming more equal. So here is one emblematic aspect of that, the United Workers Auto Strike in 1937, the sit-down strike. It was one of many actions that the auto industry was at the forefront of leading to better organization of workers to make demands across a variety of aspects. And then from the auto industry that spread to the rest of the industrial sector in the United States. There were many important strikes against General Motors, as well as the United Auto Workers. And well, this one is the General Motors, sorry. There were important strikes against both Ford and General Motors during this period. It's the same sort of thing that was very important in the second half of the British Industrial Revolution. The changes that I pointed out there cannot be understood without recognizing that Britain became more democratic, and trade unions that were very heavily prosecuted under a number of statutes in the United Kingdom became fully legal at the end in the last quarter of the 19th century. But also the nature of technology is very important. So this picture is from the Rouge plant of Henry Ford's, again, the automation against the auto factory. And you see the very revolutionary design of this factory, a large floor and a single floor, new electrical machinery, an assembly line structure which started as an interchangeable parts and then turned into assembly line. Ford was a true leader in introducing mechanical electrified power into the production process, which was a critical part of mass production. But also, Ford's factories illustrate that it wasn't just automation. You see all of these workers around the cars. They are actually playing a very critical role. They're performing more technical work than was available before the new machinery was introduced, and that technical work is critical. You couldn't produce these machines without the expertise and the work of these workers, and that's why the sit-down strike and things like that were so damaging, because production has to come to a halt. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because Ford factories were actually even more revolutionary in how they blended engineering work, information collection, clerical, white-collar workers in the background, repair management, design, quality control, and so on. And all of these are what Pasquale Restrepo and I have called, and Simon and I in the book called, new tasks for workers. And these new tasks were at the heart of creating more meaningful, higher paying jobs. And in fact, while in the first phase of the British Industrial Revolution, as I was talking about, when there were these advances in weaving, the weaver wages fell by 2/3, and much less labor was necessary for production. During this phase, automobile employment actually expanded very rapidly. So in this light, then the productivity bandwagon and the creation of shared prosperity here really depends on these two pillars. A nature or direction of technology that doesn't just focus on automation, but prioritizes new tasks, new activities, competences for workers, and worker power. So then in this light, why did things go wrong in the digital age? Why do we see this huge breakdown of shared prosperity from around 1980 onward? And I think my answer, and the answer Simon and I provide in Power and Progress, is again twofold related to these two pillars. First, too much focus on automation. Here, you see the equivalent of a car factory today, more advanced robots, but no workers around. There's this one chap here, but he's not engaged in production. He may be a supervisor or he may be a technical worker that doesn't actually touch the equipment much. So this led to higher productivity, just like in the modern factory I explained, but it did not lead to greater labor demand. In fact, many of the auto industries, especially in the United States, but also in other places as well, laid off workers as they were increasing their productivity. Now, of course, the phenomenal increase in inequality that I showed you in the US labor market since 1980 has many causes: globalization, the decline in the power of unions, which I'm going to come back to, changes in social norms, and so on. So does automation, which is what I'm emphasizing, really play such an important role? So let me try to make that point by using this figure from my work with Pasquale Restrepo. And let me explain this figure. So here on the horizontal or the vertical axis, so let me actually first explain the dots. Instead of the 10 demographic groups in the figure I showed you earlier, now I'm focusing on more disaggregated demographic groups. Each one of these circles is distinguished by gender, education, age, and ethnicity, and the size of the circle shows how big that demographic group was in 1980. And then I'm shifting the focus from the time series to the cumulative change from 1980 onwards. So if you remember in this figure here, from 1980 onwards, you see this huge increase in inequality, decline in the real wages of low education groups, especially men. So now I'm looking at the cumulative wage change from 1980 to 2016. So that period in which the inequality is increasing most. And you can see here is the zero line. Indeed, about half of these dots, about half of the labor force in workforce in the United States didn't benefit much. In fact, some of them lost a lot of wage and earnings power during this period in inflation-adjusted terms. The new element is the horizontal axis. That's our measure of automation. Roughly speaking, that's the fraction of tasks from which that demographic group has been displaced, or the fraction of tasks they used to perform in 1980 that now is automated. So you can see that some groups experienced about 20%, 25% of the tasks that they were to specialized in being automated. So that's the automation focus. And you can see there's a very strong relationship between this automation and real wage experience of the demographic group, a very strong negative one. And you cannot understand, according to this graph, which is robust, that these groups here have lost so much in terms of real wage without understanding that they are also the ones that have been exposed to most automation. But automation itself, of course, is not an act of nature, act of God. It is chosen by the market structure, and it is chosen by the priorities of managers and others. And here, it is important to understand that the technological trends in the US labor market, and more generally in the industrialized world that originated from the US, were embedded in an ideology and were embedded in a changing power distribution. This one is more familiar to you. It's one of the signature events that took place as Reagan came to power. He fired striking professional air traffic controllers. That was a big blow to organized labor, and many other companies took this as a signal that they could take a harder line against their striking workers, and that shifted the bargaining power against labor. So when digital technologies were used for automation, or wanted to be used for automation in the 50s and 60s, there were often unions that negotiated exactly how that should be done and whether there should be training for upgrading the skills of workers in the face of automation. Well, in the 1980s and 1990s, the labor movement was too weak to engage in such pushback against excessive automation. But in my mind, even more important was a shift in ideology of managers. And again, you can blame many people for this, but one emblematic person is Milton Friedman, who's a very, very famous creative economist. But his most famous article is probably nothing he wrote in academic journals, but something he wrote in the New York Review, in the New York Times Magazine, where he argued the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And that was like a carte blanche to many managers to say, don't increase wages, try to cut labor costs, and especially if that can deliver short-term increases in profits and short-term higher returns to shareholders. And in an age where there were digital tools for automation, that became a very important mantra for the business community. And the ideas of Milton Friedman spread very rapidly, both from the management consulting industry and especially from the newly expanding business schools, where the same sort of philosophy was often taught to many aspiring managers. But it's not only something you can understand with what managers did and with what unions did. Critical in understanding what happened from 1980 onwards, and therefore critical to our understanding where AI will go and where we can, whether we can change its trajectory, is where the tech industry is going. And there too, I think ideas and ideology matter perhaps more than people can first recognize. The first vision that became so influential in the tech industry, in computer science, and later in the original origin story of AI, is something that goes back to this brilliant mathematician Alan Turing. It's the idea of autonomous machine intelligence, meaning that digital tools can replicate the human brain and should strive to do that to become self-acting and highly capable of performing human tasks. And this view inexorably leads to a bias towards automation, because if you believe that machines are getting better and better and they are self-acting and intelligent, then they should take over more and more tasks. And that's what's captured, for example, in the computer industry, in the tech industry, with human parity tests. When can you reach human parity in a program or in a particular task? But very importantly for AI, this vision, which wasn't the only vision, as I'm going to explain, was sort of taken over very much by the early pioneers of AI. So the project or the conference where the field was christened in 1956, another bunch of famous scientists here, was very much in the mold of Alan Turing's self-acting autonomous intelligence. In fact, many people here predicted that within a year there would be artificial general intelligence, computers capable of doing essentially everything that humans can do. Now, I hasten to add that this was neither the only vision that guided computer scientists and technologists, nor, in fact, in my assessment, the one that led to the most important breakthrough. For example, Norbert Wiener, as early as 1949, more or less the same time as Alan Turing was writing, was articulating a different vision and also warning against excessive automation. And Simon and I call this machine usefulness as opposed to machine intelligence. In this vision, the role of tools in general is to be useful to humans, and computers are informational tools. This is the perspective that others like Douglas Engelbart, a brilliant engineer who invented the computer mouse, hyperlink, hypertext, menu-driven computers, J.C.R. Licklider, who designed ARPANET's protocols and therefore the internet's essentially backbone, were all motivated by this, and in fact articulated it, just like Norbert Wiener, a philosophical point of view and a practical point of view that really impacted the evolution of technology. But this idea that there could be human-machine symbiosis, machines working in the service of humans, fell by the wayside as AI picked up speed. But what I argue in what Simon and I argue, what I argue in my work elsewhere as well, is that in fact AI advances make this more of a reality than perhaps it was in the days of Norbert Wiener and Douglas Engelbart. And there is, in fact, a feasible direction of pro-human AI. But the same forces, the ideology of the business community, the imbalance of power, and increasingly also market structure are also meaning that we are not going in this pro-human AI direction, but we're going in a very different one. Now, this so far, I haven't emphasized productivity so much, but I want to come back and say that, in fact, pro-human AI and the right direction of technology is also critical for productivity. Because from my sort of discussion of the modern factory and other things, it may appear that whenever you automate, you increase productivity. Well, that's not actually true. And the reason is because a lot of automation is social automation, because you actually, especially if you are gripped by this vision of artificial machine intelligence, artificial general intelligence, or the vision of cost cutting. But what I was arguing is that if you are driven by an excessive focus on automation, you're not even going to get the productivity benefits, because you're going to be substituting machines and digital tools for things that humans are good at. And then you're not actually improving things. You may be making things worse. So this is what we call social automation. You do the automation, you don't give better service, you don't get much productivity, but you get all of the costs. And in fact, one of the remarkable things of the digital age is that it's not just the age of inequality, but it's age of slow productivity growth. This is US total factor productivity growth. Was very rapid in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s when we had this shared prosperity. And look at it since the digital age, it's around 0.5%, sometimes approaching 1%, but never exceeding 1%. And if you look at the rest of the industrialized world, is not doing very well. There were certain periods in which France and Germany have done better than the US, but actually over the last 10 years, they have done even worse than the United States. So productivity actually is not showing any of the revolutionary effects of technology. Same thing for the Nordic countries, but let me skip that. But I want to make another important point before I start concluding with the way forward and what can be done. We shouldn't just narrowly focus on the effects of technology on productivity and workplaces. Those are critical, especially if you want to do shared prosperity. And also they are critical for understanding where technology is, what is technology targeting and how we can use it to make lives better. But also technology has a first order effect on communication and democracy. And this is true for many types of technologies, but it's especially true for AI. And what we have seen in the digital age is also intensification of surveillance. And again, this predates AI, but it has accelerated with AI. Now, some people think, well, it's terrible when the Chinese Communist Party uses it, for example, for social credit system here. You need to get your social credit checked before you can buy a train ticket. And the social credit system is intensifying in China right now with advances in AI. But I actually don't think it's that different when it is Google or Facebook controlling all of the data and doing their own surveillance, either in terms of controlling what can be said and what cannot be said, or monetizing data using a variety of ways. And I think in the age of AI, the problem is that as these trends intensify, it is going to become a real threat to the nature of democracy. And I think the best way of understanding this is actually going back to a comment that Hannah Arendt made 50 years ago, even before the digital age, when she said, when everybody lies to you, the problem isn't that you believe the lies, but nobody believes anything any longer. So when you have this sort of centralized control of information and manipulative technologies, much worse than Bentham's panopticon, I think it starts breaking down the shared knowledge, shared understanding foundations of democracy. And that's very important because I think democracy is valuable in and of itself, is a central part of our identity, but also democratic governance is the best way of fixing the problems that we have with the technology and with shared prosperity. So in conclusion, the last 3 slides, I want to talk about what it is that we can do. I am not advocating that AI is in and itself bad. AI provides many opportunities, and I think some of them can be truly pro-worker as well as pro-democracy. But the problem is that if AI is left in an unregulated fashion in the hands of some very, very powerful technology leaders with their own selfish agenda or their own ideological agenda, you're not going to get there. In fact, you're likely to get to some really weird places. So you shouldn't view technology as something that's just the outcome of individual genius, whether it's Sam Altman or Elon Musk. Countervailing powers are key. Countervailing powers against business, especially big business, comes from government regulation, but government regulation is often embedded in consumer activism, civil society organizations, for example, Ralph Nader and his organization and others around it who played a critical role in quality control, safety regulations in pharmaceutical, car industry, and so on. And it also comes from trade unions, which I, of course, don't need to tell you guys about that. But building countervailing powers for the age of AI is no trivial. And in the Q&A, we can come back to my views as to why, especially in the United States, but also perhaps elsewhere, we need different labor organizations and different priorities for that. But the most important point I want to make again is that it is not a question of more technology versus less technology. It's a question of redirecting technological change. Ever since the beginning of the computer age, there have been many different luminaries like Norbert Wiener, Engelbart, J.C.R. Licklider, I mentioned. There were many others who were at the forefront of technology, like Ted Nelson, who all articulated ideas of how computers could be used for in a pro-worker way, more decentralized, more enabling of workers, more enabling of citizens, more enabling of smaller corporations ahead of large corporations such as IBM or Microsoft. But at the end, none of these turned into reality, not because they were impossible, but because they did not have either the backing of the government or the business models to make them profitable endeavors. But it is possible, and in fact, I think even more likely in the age of AI, that we can use AI to create new tasks for workers and increase worker marginal productivity. And in essence, that's because AI is an informational technology, and it's a question of who is going to benefit the information and what type of information we're going to give. We can give information to make workers more productive in problem solving and becoming more expert, for their training, for expanding them to perform more sophisticated tasks and new tasks, and also gain greater worker autonomy. Now, the problem is we're not going to get there unless we have these countervailing powers, and we're not going to get the countervailing powers unless the tech industry changes. So that's, I think, the catch-22. But I want to end by showing that what I am saying is not just a pie in the sky. Redirecting technological change and redirecting because of government regulation, government policies, and civil society pushback is possible. And the energy sector actually illustrates it best. As late as 2000, late 2000s, the renewable technologies were 10 times more expensive, mostly, than fossil fuels. But around the middle of the 2000s, there was a bigger push from regulation, carbon taxes in a few countries, especially Sweden, and government subsidies to renewable technologies in the US, in Europe, in China. And even with this small modicum of support, there was tremendous technological progress, learning by doing, economies of scale. And today in production of energy, actually renewables are more cost effective than fossil fuels. What was done in the energy sector needs to be done more, but it needs also to be repeated even more importantly in how we use AI. And I think that is going to be the challenge in the age of AI for all democratic nations and for all worker organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before getting into those questions, sort of looking ahead, I must ask you, having listened to you and the problems that we got in the 70s, 80s, why did the Friedman doctrine get so dominant?
I think with many things, Friedman, with many things that I'm talking about, when I attach names, like J.C.R. Licklider or the Friedman doctrine, some of those ideas were in the air. Friedman wasn't the first one to articulate these things, but I think he articulated them particularly strongly. but it also came at an opportune time where the labor movement was getting weaker already. And there I want to, the account I gave during my talk was a little bit partial. I emphasized Reagan, but many labor economists would say, the labor movement was in trouble before Reagan because both the laws in the United States, which makes it very different to be a union than in, say, Sweden, and also because of the industrialization, the industrial manufacturing sector the employment was declining even then. So the push against that wasn't there. But then the political pendulum was already shifting against regulations, and the way that the Friedman Doctrine was read by many managers is, look, we can actually do what's good for us and also have the justification that we're doing something good by cutting wages, because that's actually good for investment, that's good for productivity growth. If we are not regulated, then that's going to create more innovation. So all of these things became sort of self-reinforcing. But I think the heart of, to me, the Friedman Doctrine is, and the reason why I find it so troubling, is that I think many managers left to their own devices because of public pressure, because of other things, will have a tendency to share some of the productivity benefits with the worker. They may not do it enough. They will do it much more if there are unions and there is robust negotiation. But there is an element of what people in the institutional economists of the 1930s, 40s used to call welfare capitalism. You increase profits, and then you share some of it with your workers. And the most damaging part of the Friedman Doctrine is that as a manager, you're very well justified not to do that. And that really changed the dynamics among top managers in the United States, and then those ideas spread to the rest of the industrialized world.
Okay, the topic of this conference is like labor market partners, that is unions and employers, organizations, yes, and policy. So if we start sort of asking your policy or your recommendations for all these three parties, if we start with the employers, I suppose you get to talk to them, the managers and the tech companies and the employers today as well. What's their response on when you say that we need a stronger labor movement?
Well, I mean, I think, the part of the reason why this conference is important and part of the reason why the Swedish experience is so important is because, I talked about welfare capitalism. But, welfare capitalism was perhaps practiced in a very weak form in the US at some point. And I think the best example of welfare capitalism is in the Nordic countries. So employers and unions working together, that's both good for employers and for sharing of those benefits. And I think that's critical. The labor movement is never going to be successful if it presents to the following bargain to the employers. What we want is bad for you is good for us. That's never going to work. Mm. So I think for the labor unions, it is very important to find that sweet spot where they can get good outcomes for their members, but at the same time, they can work with employers. And I think for employers, that's also a very critical thing, but also even more critical. And again, this is where the Friedman Doctrine comes in. And this is what I sort of say to business leaders when I get a chance to talk to them. I don't talk to them that often. Don't think, Laura, that they're queuing up outside my door. But what I say to them when I get a chance is, simplifying it a little bit, there are two ways of thinking. You can either think of labor as a cost to be cut, or you can think of labor as your most important resource, that if you're going to be innovative, you're going to be productive, that's your labor. If you have the second perspective, then you have a much more natural urge to use technology to make that labor more productive. Not to sideline labor, but contribute to that labor's capacity, knowledge, training, skills, and reach. And I think that's very important in this age. There are some companies that made profits in the short term by just trying to sideline labor. But I think the most important companies, and sometimes they forget that history, are the ones that get the best out of their employees. And I think AI, again, creates, if we use it right, could create the kind of technological platform on which we can make workers much better. That's what we need to strive for.
an important part of the Swedish business life got to listen to you in last August in Tylösand, where SNS invited you to their conference, and I actually was there as well and got to ask you basically the same question. So you had the ear of the Swedish business life for a moment, at least in August. What they've done with that, we'll see. The second part in this game is the unions, of course, and I think you sound a bit optimistic about the AI and labor power. There are possibilities. So, do you think that the Swedish or trade unions in general should promote the use of AI?
Well, I'll answer that. I think that's very, very important. That's a critical thing. But I want to make one other comment first, which is, I think, reflects my viewpoint and probably will be different from the practice, which is that I think in this age, we really have to think of, 3 or 4 partners. You can think of employers and unions, or in Sweden, there's employers, unions, and government. The corporatist model had all 3 of them. But you also have to have the tech sector. So, because at the end of the day, if you have the best intentioned firms and the best intentioned and best communicating unions that can work with these firms, but all technologies that are coming are for automation, there isn't much that they can do. So that's why the tech industry has to be part of the equation as well. And we can come back to that. But let me tell you on the unions, and I am both optimistic and pessimistic on unions. And here is my perspective, which is that, and this is more, my pessimism is more US based, because in the US, the law and the practice makes unions bargain very narrowly. Industry union negotiations are not allowed. And most of the negotiations in the US are on wages. And if in an age when there are plenty of automation technologies, unions become more powerful and they ask for higher wages, what will that do? It will encourage employers to do even more automation, because they have all of these automation technologies abundant. Suddenly labor becomes more expensive. They'll say, okay, fine, we'll do even more automation. So the solution to that is twofold. One is this, what I said earlier on, which is that unions have to find, I hate this sort of business school speak, but let me use it, win-win, which is something that's good for them, something for the employers. And that cannot be done just by negotiating on wages. Unions have to bring the negotiation to technology as well. How are we going to use technology? How are we going to train the workers? How are we going to build the expertise of workers? So I think that is critical. And I think there's much more room for this in the Nordic countries, in Sweden. But I think US has to move in that direction as well. The second important point there is, of course, those capabilities, those kind of negotiations, these win-win things are going to be much more feasible if we can steer the direction of technology so that tech companies don't just produce automation tools, but they produce tools that can that can make workers more productive, that can make workers more capable, that can facilitate training and so on. So again, the tech companies have to be part of the equation. And why am I optimistic? Well, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful, because I see a complete change, for example, in the union movement's leadership in the United States. So if I had this, and I had some conversations like this with some union leaders 5-6 years ago, that was just like speaking a foreign language. Today, AFL-CIO, for example, has a technology office that is very high profile, and they're trying to gain expertise on AI. They're bringing AI-related negotiations into many of their practices. So I think there is a general awakening of, if we are not current with the developments of AI, we're just going to be left behind, and it's going to be worse for workers. And I think they're also shifting. They're not there yet, but to the perspective that I'm advocating, it's not AI versus no AI, and it's not slowing down AI. It's changing the direction of AI, how we're going to use AI. And the best example for this, and the best case for me of optimism, is the Writers Guild of America's strike against Hollywood. At the end, the Writers Guild of America sort of found the right balance. They said, no, we're not against AI, but we want AI to be controlled by our workers, not by managers and bosses.
The third question is, of course, on policy, on government, the institutions that they are responsible for. What's your... I told you that there is a Swedish Productivity Commission. We've listened to their first report here. They are continuing to work in order to rise the productivity in the Swedish economy. What's your best policy advice for them? What should the government do?
Well, I think policy, there is no magic bullet here. You have to use multi-pronged policies, and they are going to be very different for the US versus Europe. Look, Europe right now is far ahead of the US in terms of regulation of AI, and it has enshrined through the EU a number of important principles. But on the other hand, Europe has an innovation deficit. So part of the reason why European productivity, then that's true in Sweden, that's true in France, it's true in Germany, has done worse than the US is because these countries have not been sufficiently innovative in some of the dynamic sectors. So I think innovating is very important. In the United States, on the other hand, the problem is perhaps too much innovation. They're innovating too fast without worrying about the direction and without worrying about how we can regulate these technologies. So the problems are different. And I think both of them are leading to bad productivity outcomes, because if you're innovating in directions that are not going to be productivity enhancing, but especially they're going to be very good for the market share of companies such as OpenAI, Microsoft, or Google, you're not going to get the productivity miracle. You're going to get even a more oligarchic, more concentrated structure, more venture capital funding, but none of the benefits. But Europe, I think, needs to create an ecosystem of innovation in AI. And I think that's why I emphasize, the Nordic countries have been the leaders in this corporatist triangle: employers, trade unions, government. So now perhaps we need to think of this as a rectangle. Government, trade unions, employers, and the tech sector. And I think the tech sector needs to, an indigenous tech sector with the right ecosystem needs to emerge in Europe.
Great. Now we have time for one or two short questions from the audience. Do you have one? Raise your hand. They are so taken by your presentation, so I get to ask the last question. Together with some colleagues, you've launched something called Shaping the Future of Work, and some of the American unions are partners in this initiative. Can you tell us something about that? Will that be in the next book, or what is that?
Yeah, the next book and the next series of papers. And I think we are very proud of what we are doing. I'm working on this with Simon Johnson and David Otter, but we are especially proud of our name, because what we are trying to emphasize with the name is that, contrary to some of the debates where the question is, what will AI do to inequality? What will AI do to unemployment? What will AI do to jobs? Well, AI will do whatever we choose it to do. So I think the task ahead of us as academics, as policymakers, as unionists, as employers, to shape the future of work. And it's there to be shaped. We can make choices where we continue with automation, we continue with surveillance, and we are left with meaningless, low-paid jobs for at some point it's going to be a smaller population, which is not going to be meaningful. It's not going to create good jobs. It's not going to create shared prosperity. But we can shape the future of work in a way along the lines of what I've talked about, with the right policies, with the right inducements and regulation of the tech industry, so that we create new capacities for workers. And that could lead to a much more meaningful future. Again, what I want to emphasize here is there's nothing wrong with automation. Nobody wants to go back to the days in which, production required heavy physical manual work, that you had to use shovels and muscles instead of cranes and excavators. But if all we do is automation, I think it cannot be good for workers. It cannot be good for good jobs. It cannot be good for inequality. So it is very important that we use the platform that AI provides to create new capabilities for workers. And unfortunately, that's not where the tech industry is going. And that's why this is a moment of policy, this is a moment of civil society, and this is a moment of countervailing powers, because if there is that potential for shared prosperity for labor, but we're not going there, and I think there is an element of, well, can we shape it in the way that we want by pushing the tech industry, by regulating it, by getting rid of its worst excesses?
Thank you very much. Shaping the future of work, I think I can talk for the organizers and probably the whole room. We want to be a part of that movement, shaping the future of work. Thank you very much for your great presentation and the discussion. We give you a warm hand and hope to invite you back to Sweden.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for everybody for hosting me, and thank you.
See you.